In this video, I want to talk about the economy of the frontier, and it's really not much of an economy in the traditional sense of the word. It's more like survival. Uh, Poor pioneers went west, and they're constantly pushing back the frontier, and life was always hard. They're so far out there that they're removed from in the south, the large plantations, or in the north, the economic life of the cities. They're kind of on their own, producing all they need. They would follow Indian paths uh, westward and initially, and they would, they'd be lucky if they arrived in the wilderness with maybe the physical resources of a horse or an oxen and some hand tools and a supply of corn flour or a harrow or something. Uh, this process that I'm going to talk about is one that continued all the way throughout the colonial period, not just in the 1600s, but into the 1700s, the 18th century. By during the 1600s, this process is going on pretty much up to the Appalachian Mountains. But after 1700, you're going to see the same central process continuing uh, up to the over the Allegheny Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, and by the end of the colonial period, Western settlers were actually reaching the Mississippi River. The first step for a new arrival was to clear a plot of land large enough for a small food plot to get them through the first winter. In this first wave, pioneers were kind of as much as hunter-gatherers, depending on the surrounding forest, as much as uh, you know uh, farmers. They would gather berries and nuts for the winter. They learned from the Indians to plant quick maturing crops. Well, they squash, pumpkins, corn, and beans, and they even adopted the small, round, mixed agriculture of the Indians in the 1600s. Pioneers would often search out deserted Indian clearings for their homestead, and there's even some evidence that Plymouth Colony itself in the 1600s was chosen because it was a site of an open Indian field. During the first long, cold winter in the wilderness, pioneers would cut more substantial trees that they didn't have time to do earlier. They, would have more land cleared for a greater crop when the spring planting season arrived. Try digging up one of those stumps in a forest. Think of the labor that goes into that. So, and they would also in that first winter begin to construct some type of of a home, a substantial home. And the log cabin was first introduced by Swedish settlers in 1638 in the Delaware region. And only a few years, by the end of the 1600s, log cabins were on the frontier in every colony. Log cabins were great because they used the materials available. The logs were interlocked by cutting one on top of another. And between the logs, the pioneers put what later they called chinking, chips, sticks, moss, and daubing, which was like mud or clay, but it would solidify it so there wouldn't be a draft between the logs. The roof formed sort of an inverted V. It was layered with poles and bark or thatching, which is sort of, bound bundles of straw. In time, usually the second winter or so, pioneers had time to cut shingles for a more substantial roof, and also to build like a stone fireplace to lessen the risk of fire in the house. In the years that followed, farmers were usually able to clear a much greater area than the couple acres they might clear in that first year. A skilled, energetic woodsman working full-time with his family might axe an acre a week, even when their trees were large and dense. As I said, pulling up those stumps was the hard part. Also, important was to build a substantial wooden fence because you wanted to keep out the animals. And given the fact that they had to cut wood for fuel and heat, think of all the effort that went in constantly cutting trees, and they had to dig as well a well for fresh water. As I said, this process continued not just in the 17th century, but into the 18th century, the 1700s. And, the frontier was constantly moving westward, as I say. Uh, by the 1700s, much of the land in the the eastern part was, it's developed, not like the 1600s. Here you can see a pretty developed farm. It's been there for a while. The An English traveler, Andrew Burnaby, was so impressed in 1759 when he made the 100-mile trip between Annapolis and Philadelphia. He reported that, geez, almost a half of the country was cleared of the forest. And so you can see how here in the little red that's 100 miles right at the Revolution, and only half of that was cleared with forest, and that was impressive. So if you imagine what it was like closer to the Appalachian Mountains in the 1600s, you're really still out there in the wilderness, even though you're east of the Appalachian Mountains in the 1600s. Settlers in New England believed that they could identify stages from from the transition from wilderness to settled and cultivated land. They started out with what they called waste. It was untouched wilderness, barren rocks, and swamps. They said they called it waste. Then there was the unbroken land. That's when the field had been sort of uncleared but surveyed and titled, and then they would go to work developing it, and they called it broken, and that was when it was cleared, but it wasn't fenced or planted. And finally, you get improved or dressed land. That was land that was planted and fenced, and this process again was the process that would take a long time. As this process continued, you're really getting us, as I say, a lot of demand for wood. And if it's cold winter, you got to be burning wood to stay warm. A skilled axeman could cut, split, and stack more than a cord of wood. That's a 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot amount of wood shown here. But in one cold northern winter, he might consume 20 or 30 cords. And so he'd have to cut down 10 to 20 acres of woodland just to keep the fire burning in the large fireplace. As you get into the 1700s, the 18th century, and you get more improved or dressed land, wood became even increasingly valuable back east because they didn't have the land that had all been cut, and so they had to buy it at higher rates. This is a bit of an irony because if you're out in the frontier, it's there's wood plentiful, but you're just cutting it constantly. In the 1600s, which you're focusing on here, they had these houses would have big drafty fireplaces, stone fireplaces I talked about. But when you get into the 1700s, they began to get wood burning stoves that replace these big fireplaces, and they use less wood and more, so it got a little easier. You didn't have to cut quite as much. You're more efficient at cooking and heating the home. For those settlers on the frontier, living on the edge of the wilderness could be rough, not only for all the demands physically, but also because of the relative isolation. Uh, you had to stay there in case there were additional or subsequent settlers coming in and just taking over your little area. The more and more pioneers quite literally lived off the map, and this process was going on, and so you'd lose news of the rest of the world. Uh, Even as late as the American Revolution, there were people on the frontier that didn't even know about it. Way out there. Many people in the 1600s feared for themselves and their souls because they were in the ungodly, savage wilderness, and I mentioned earlier, wilderness was seen as evil and the absence of God. And there are many frontier accounts of wives going mad or husbands becoming violent, domestic abuse. To the extent that you could travel, that of course was determined by uh, where you were and when. I mean, if you're in the far distant frontier in the 1600s, or you're probably not doing much traveling at all. If the land's becoming more settled and time passes, you might have a wagon be able to pull and so forth. So, but any way you look at it, even in the more settled areas in the later period, uh, a, a settler couldn't go very far, especially in the winter. I mean, sometimes in New England, winters were just so bad you couldn't travel at all, and spring rains would often turn what paths and roads there were just so wet and muddy it was impossible to even travel at all then too. And so all of this just made the frontier life not only very burdensome, but isolating as well. If you were near a river in the 1600s, early in the 1600s, if you could still be a frontier near a river, and obviously you had some transportation on the rivers. But by the 1700s, what's happening is you're getting up near the Appalachian Mountains, and the rivers are not navigable that far out, of course. As time passed and more areas were settled, I mean, the frontier is continually moving westward, and you have a homestead. Maybe the paths around your homestead are getting wider, and you might get wagons through. And so what ends up happening is you begin to have traveling merchants begin to sell their goods. They go from homestead to homestead, offering to sell or barter, I should say, things that they'd gotten further east. And by the 1700s, the 18th century, you're going to see these towns beginning to move westward. These towns begin to replace these traveling merchants. I'm going to talk more about the changing life from the 17th to the 18th century, from the 1600s to 1700s, in a subsequent series of videos. But in any event, this concludes the short video on the economic life of the frontier. And again, it's not much economic life other than just survival.